Hello, my name is Jeffrey Nicholas. I'm an associate professor of philosophy at Providence College. This is a continuing lecture in a series of lectures on Aristotle's virtue ethics. There are uh, 9 listed lectures. I actually did an intermediate lecture here on justice. So you'll find that lecture along with these others on my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about intellectual virtues. Now, if you've read the Nicomachean Ethics, you know that Aristotle's discussion of intellectual virtues comes earlier in his book, so it comes before discussions of friendship. I thought it was important to put it after this discussion of contemplation, however. To defend the idea of contemplation is important, I think, is necessary for understanding Aristotle's approach here. And it's so abstract to us and so foreign to us in the 21st century that I thought defending contemplation first would be more important than following the outline that Aristotle has. So if you have not watched that lecture, I invite you to go back to my YouTube channel and watch that lecture on contemplation. I also want to say that in our current culture in the United States, in a culture of fake news, that this lecture is, in fact, a very radical lecture for us because the focus is on truth. Now, I'm not going to be talking about politics, but the underlying context here is that there are certain intellectual virtues that we need in our lives if we're going to achieve eudaimonia, and we've talked about eudaimonia in a number of lectures, and it's this idea of self-fulfillment or self-realization, coming to a fullness of who we are as people, really developing our abilities, particularly our human abilities, our ability to think, to be creative, to love, and to think about the pursuit of truth as part of that eudaimonistic life is a significant challenge, I think, to the contemporary world, but especially to politics, the kind of American style, a very aggressive, a very in-your-face politics of the 21st century. Um, that's a context here. I will be focusing more on the idea of the intellectual virtues. So where do these come from? Well, you might remember that Aristotle divides the human soul into 2 parts, the irrational part and the rational part. The irrational part, of course, has the appetites and other aspects to it. The rational part has 2 aspects to it as well. So the rational part has one aspect that is reason itself or theory, and the other aspect that is practical wisdom. We're going to talk about the virtues that are involved in both of those. Now, we're thinking here about truth. Reason is, of course, the capacity for human beings to reach truth, and this is an aspect of our souls that define us in contrast to other living beings, or at least all the living beings that we know. We could talk a little bit maybe about dolphins and whales and other members of the great ape family, but what we know about human beings is that we have a particular kind of intellect. So the other animals that we might talk about have sense perception, and they have longing. Sense perception, of course, that is not the origin of action, but it helps us to understand what we're doing. Longing is the origin of action. So I see an orange. It's the longing for the orange that makes me walk over to the tree and pick the orange. The intellect here for human beings has a role to play in this, but there's a great capacity for the human intellect to be symbolic and to put the longing within a particular context for us. So the intellect guides our action, but it also helps us to understand what the good is for us in a way that non-human animals cannot get to. If you're interested in that kind of discussion, I invite you to read Alistair MacIntyre's Dependent Rational Animals, which goes into that kind of distinction. Now, I've said that for Aristotle, the reasoning aspect, the rational aspect of the soul has 2 parts. One is theory, what he'll call scientific, and the other is practical, or what he'll call calculating. So the scientific part, the theoretical part, is about thought, not about action, and is concerned with the pure distinction between true and false. Now remember, when Aristotle is using the term scientific, he's not thinking about STEM, okay? He's not thinking about simply biology, simply chemistry, simply mathematics. For him, philosophy is the queen of the sciences, and that is the process by which we get to truth and avoid falseness. The calculating part, the practical reasoning part, here we're thinking about choice, and choice that is marked by deliberation. So our reasoning must be true and the longing that we have correct. And we've talked a little bit about this in terms of incontinence in an earlier lecture. But here we're focusing on the intellectual virtues that help us to reach true here, right? So what the reasoning asserts must be what the longing pursues. And so we see acting well as the end, right? To what we're trying to do with our phonetic part, with our part that is dealing with what we call phronesis. So for Aristotle, choice then can be one of two things. It's either the intellect marked by a certain longing, or it is longing marked by a certain kind of thinking. So in the first case, we might think about an action, and the thought does not end in action itself, right? We have to have the thought along with a longing for the end, and I gave the example of the orange before. But we also might have a longing that is marked by thinking, and here the goal comes first, the longing comes first, and we think about what is the value of this goal and how we get to it. But the idea that I think is important for us to keep in mind is that when we think about choice, for Aristotle, it involves both the intellect and the appetite. Whereas today we typically think about choice as being just about having a desire for something. And Aristotle is saying, no, we have to think about that desire in relationship to the pursuit of truth. Okay? Because as human beings, choice is the starting point. Okay? Now, to get us back to truth, then, there are 5 states or ways of arriving at truth. There's art or craft. There's science, which again is broader than what we think of today as science. There's prudence, wisdom, and intellect. And I want to just spend a little bit of time going over each of these. So we begin with science, right? Science concerns things that do not admit being otherwise. So this is a little odd for us today, of course, because we can do so much with our science today, but that shows again that Aristotle's not talking simply about the kinds of STEM sciences. He's talking about understanding the world as it is, right? And kind of and trying to understand the causes of things. So here we're talking about necessity, right? The necessity that 2 plus 2 is 4. Or we might talk about Euclid's 5 principles, that the shortest point between, the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, right? That's has a necessity to it. Now, of course, we know that there's other kinds of geometry that we might study today, but we're just getting to the idea that when we look at science as a particular method of arriving at truth, we're looking at how we understand the world and the kinds of causes that are in it and the necessity that applies with those causes. Now, the next kind of topic of truth deals with art or craft. And so Aristotle says that making and acting, in contrast to science, both admit of being otherwise, right? So we could make this pot be brown or black. We could make this cup be round or square. So we're dealing with things that don't involve necessity. But of course, there's a difference between making and acting, right? So when we're talking about making, we're talking about art or craft. And here we're concerned with production, what comes into being and how we produce these things. How do we have truth that helps us to guide us in terms of producing the kinds of things that we want? Okay. Prudence, on the other hand, deals with acting, right? Being able to deliberate about what is good and beneficial, about what leads to living well. So remember, we have to go back all the time to the idea that happiness and living well is the key concept here. And when Aristotle is talking about living well, he says that the goal of human life is not simply to live, but to live well, to find this kind of self-realization. So science isn't part of prudence because prudence is about things that can be otherwise, but science is about what is necessary. And art isn't dealing with prudence because art is about production, not about living the good life. Here then, prudence needs temperance because temperance helps us to preserve our wisdom, or I'm sorry, our prudence from the temptation of the pleasant and the painful. So prudence helps us to figure out what the goal is, and temperance helps us to stay true to our prudence. It is a virtue necessary for the formation of opinion. And again, when he's talking about opinion here, he's not talking about the way that we use opinion, where, oh, I just have an opinion that I like this. He's talking about having what we would call educated beliefs or educated opinion. Okay, and so we're dealing with what is the best life here and how prudence helps us to achieve that best life. So prudence concerns knowledge of the good for the self and the good for the whole. So what's good for me and what's good for the society as a whole. And this gets tied into concepts that come back in Aristotle's discussion of the politics with household management and political system. Again, we're putting that aside for now. We can move on to wisdom. Here, wisdom is understanding plus scientific knowledge about those things that are noble. So today we might think about noble things like the study of God and theology. That would be where wisdom lies. Of course, wisdom is broader than that. And so we might think about, all of those things which are noble, the first principles of life, the first principles of every science. That's where wisdom lies. And so the wise person knows both the first principles and what follows from those principles. He's concerned with what we might call universals. The wise person is concerned with trying to come to a grasp of the nature of reality. The intellect, of course, is the aspect in us that grasps these first principles. Wisdom is trying to understand them and figure out where they fit into the whole part of human life. The intellect is what grasps them. Now, wisdom and prudence, we use these in our everyday life. So these are things that are choice-worthy in themselves. Having wisdom, having prudence, seeking the truth. These are virtues of the different parts of the soul. So wisdom is a virtue of the theoretical part, prudence is a virtue of the practical part. Wisdom, of course, does help to produce happiness, just as prudence allows us to pursue the ends that we are seeking. Virtue, as we recall from our third lecture, involves deliberation, right? And so the use of correct reason. So if we're going to be virtuous, we need wisdom so that we know what the first principles are, so that we know what happiness is, and so that we know the characteristics of human life in the world in order to contextualize our actions. And then prudence is necessary for us to determine what is the best choice for us in any given situation. So again, another lecture here where we talk about the intellectual virtues. Important to relate that to the role of contemplation in our life, but also the role of friendship, and to situate that within the idea of a life of eudaimonia, a life of the pursuit of self-realization.